During this time of Lent, we are on the way to the cross with Jesus, to learn how to follow Jesus, how to live the way of the cross. That even with all its challenges, it is the way to an abundant life of purpose and fulfillment. The challenges of following Jesus are obstacles, and they are many along this way that seek to deter and derail or delay us. One obstacle can be our current circumstance that makes following Jesus seem impossible. You've heard it before. Life happens while we are busy making other plans. Life can interrupt our best laid plans. And often these circumstances are unexpected and out of our control. But at other times, those obstacles are of our own making. When we allow self-doubt and self-sabotage to take over, because following Jesus often means change. Changed responsibilities, changed relationships, and even identity. And oh, how we prefer things to stay the same. But Jesus didn't come for that. Jesus didn't come to leave things unchanged. Abram, in our first reading today, ran into the obstacle of circumstance when God offered possibilities and made promises of many descendants in a vast land to a 90-something-year-old couple who, number one, had no children, number two, owned no real estate. I first sensed God's call to ministry when I was 12, and the obstacle of circumstance was that the Lutheran Church did not ordain women in 1962. And when I sensed that call again, at the age of 50, the obstacles were being 30 years out of college. I didn't know how much that would matter. Being divorced and a single mom of 2 teenage boys. It seemed impossible as Abram and Sarai having children. Another obstacle to the way is the perceptions and opinions of others. Doesn't everybody have one when you decide to do something? When Abram first embraced God's unimaginable promises, Sarai expressed her opinion. She laughed. She laughed out loud at God. But then, who would blame her? We'd probably laugh also. When I announced I would be quitting my job to begin seminary, I got the same thing. People laughed at such a crazy idea. One son asked, "Are we going to be poor?" And my father pointed out, as if I didn't know it, "You still have 2 kids to raise." And when I pointed out that the time when I was in high school and he quit his job with no prospects of job or home to move to Florida because he was sick of the snow, he said that was different. And I said, yeah, it was different. You had 4 kids to raise. Probably the greatest obstacle to living the way is that it is total countercultural. It's completely opposite to the world's ways and values and goals. And we feel like we're swimming upstream because we are. Cultural expectations told Abram he was a crazy centurion to leave his home behind and then wait for years for promised children. I think it was more than just his wife who laughed at him. And even though Lutherans have been ordaining women for years, there is still a cultural resistance to having a female pastor until you have one. God provides the way around such obstacles, and it takes God's clarification and assurance to keep us from choosing to stay stuck where we are or giving up on God's possibilities for us. After many, 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 many years of waiting for the promised child, the Lord spoke to Abram again. "Do not be afraid. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. Abram said, yeah, right. I've heard this before. And he responded by crying out in pain to God about having no heir as promised, as God promised him. What the heck is up, God? I've waited and waited. But what Abram shows us is that we are to make our problems God's problems because he cares. And by telling God about our deepest hurts and unmet needs, it expresses to God our belief and faith that God truly has the power and ability to respond. Our crying to God expresses to God our faith. And the Lord responds to Abram with a tangible sign then of an expanded promise. Gaze up at the heavens and count the stars if you are able. So shall your descendants be. God not only visibly clarified his promise, but also expanded his promise from one child to many, to so many they can't be counted. God often, usually, gives way more than we expect. And with this divine clarification, Abram was able to again believe and trust God, and the Lord provided then divine assurance by making a covenant, a breathtaking, absolute commitment. God ritually commits to die rather than break his promise to Abram. David and I have learned to ask for, to watch for, receive such divine clarification and assurance through many difficult things since we've been together. And we have found that even though we have to remind each other to trust God, the more we trust, the more we are able to trust, until trusting God becomes an automatic response to the obstacles along the way. God provides the way around faith. God provides the way to us through faith. Through Abram's faith, God fulfilled his promises. Not immediately, not at once, but over a long, long time, God's time. And that faith sustains us as we wait for God's promises to become a reality. The way around takes what Paul calls having the mind of Christ, that is claiming our heavenly citizenship and being imitators of Christ. This means avoiding or giving up privilege and power for ourselves and doing things in our way, all for the sake of following God's way, the way of Christ, the way of the cross. We see this mind of Christ on Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. After the transfiguration, Luke says that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem, which means Jesus is so determined that nothing will deter Jesus from going. Nothing at all, no matter what. He's going. And that's because Jesus' mother instilled this determination. The words of her song, Mary's song, the Magnificat, if you remember, and the sermon Jesus preached in Nazareth about bringing down the high and lifting up the low. It expressed their knowledge and their acceptance that his identity and destiny would not lead to a worldly happy ending. But Jesus' absolute determination allows us to set our faces toward the way, despite the obstacles we will face, despite the difficulties and the challenges, knowing that God will provide us a way around. Luke takes 10 chapters for Jesus to get to Jerusalem. Why in the world does it take Jesus so long? Jesus takes time along the way to heal and teach, to engage his opponents, to bless children, to restore those pushed to the side, to liberate the captive. He tends to all those robbed of God's promised abundant life, to show us what we are to do along the way. Share stories about God's unending love. Persist in prayer. Pursue justice and lament for those who refuse God's embrace and choose to cling to the protections and prizes of the world. Jesus, while on his way to the cross, shows us that God is still at work here and now, in us and through us. Paul instructs us that having the mind of Christ means claiming our heavenly citizenship by denouncing the world's ways of self-preservation and self-satisfaction and self-indulgence, and instead pledging allegiance above all other to being faithful Christ imitators, holding to a higher loyalty, the Lord Jesus Christ, and accepting the obstacles of suffering with confidence that God will lead us in the way around. There are people out to get us on this journey. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Jesus is vulnerable on his journey because there is a fox in the henhouse. And we all know there's nothing that threatens or makes hens more vulnerable and afraid than a fox in the henhouse. Jesus has caused quite a stir in his 3-year ministry, making King Herod uneasy and threatened because he was none of the things God required to be a true king, to be a ruler over people, who was to be a shepherding provider and protector of the people. No, Herod was none of those things. Herod is the sly fox on the loose in Israel's henhouse, wanting to do anything to stop things that threaten his power. And in this story, God is the mother hen protecting her chicks, as you heard Sharon tell you. Protecting her chicks under her wings against the fox. Jesus' answer to Jesus's and our vulnerability is divine protection by a parent who loves us with a fierce motherly love and who will shelter her brood no matter the threat. You moms know this feeling. Jesus' future is not Herod's to decide. God is setting his travel agenda. Jesus heads to Jerusalem knowing he will come face to face with that fox, fully confident of mother hen's protection. Jesus reminds us that we have the same mothering God, waiting to wrap her soft and protective wings around us, to protect us in the midst of any of these obstacles or sly foxes that make us vulnerable, and to guide us in the way around, to continue on the way that God has chosen for us. Jesus is on the way to an end that is really a beginning. Jesus' resurrection is the ultimate triumph of sacrificial love over death and hate and injustice and bigotry, and all obstacles that stand against the will of God to love, bless, and save this whole world. But they're still here. They're not totally defeated. And so God works in and through all the small and large things we do out of that same kind of sacrificial love for the sake of the world. What you do, what we do, matters. It matters to God. It matters to the whole world. Amen. Amen.